much and congratulations. So unlike many lawyers bringing cases against journalists, you're often in the corner of journalists working with media houses. Is this a great achievement for you? Let's start there.
Francis, I'm afraid we have a broken connection because I couldn't hear your question. But may I say that it is an absolute honor to be on the panel. And I hope that we are able to discharge the awesome responsibility that we've been given and assist in the defense and the protection of media freedom globally.
If you can hear me, Dario, how serious are the threats to journalism right now across the world?
Get that, Francis.
All right, let's try again. Dario, we're going to try and work on that sound. If you can hear me, how serious are the threats to journalism right now?
Well, nearly 100 journalists were killed simply for doing their job last year. And one of the priorities of the panel that we will be focusing on is the enhancing the safety of journalists. That is to ensure that journalists are safe from harassment, from fake news, from targeted attacks and trolling on social media, and then, of course, abduction and killings, which we've seen in recent years, unfortunately, on the increase against journalists. The other important part of the panel's work will be on drafting model laws to ensure that best practice is proposed to a number of countries around the world, and that countries can be measured in an objective and scientific way against media freedom best practice.
It's not just words, like you say. So the US seemed to do very little about Khashoggi killed in the Turkish embassy. Is that alarming? Are we living in alarming times, actually?
Well, I'm afraid so, Francis. And in fact, one of the themes at the Global Conference on Media Freedom, which was convened last week in London by the Canadian and UK governments, and where our panel was announced, one of the themes is how, many countries around the world, such as the United States, which one holds up as high watermarks of protection of freedom of expression in the past, have deteriorated significantly, not least because of comments that have been made about the press and the media being the enemy of the people. So one needs vigilance, not just with democracies that have established media freedom laws and principles, because not just what's on paper, but also the culture around media freedom and the practice around media freedom in a particular country. Right. And that is something one must focus on.
So Dario, stay with us. We now have that clip of Amal Clooney talking about leaders like Donald Trump often using that phrase, the enemy of the people. Let's listen.
We have to be vigilant, and we also have to know that what happens in a country like Australia or the UK or the US will be looked at by every other leader in the world and potentially used as an excuse to clamp down even further on journalists. And they would, I think journalists all over the world are less safe if the rhetoric or even policies or laws in states that are supposed to be free are actually a threat to journalists in those countries.
Dario, she has said that if journalists don't have rights, everyone loses. Is that understanding of journalists as the guardians of human rights, the protectors of freedom, being eroded?
Well, Francis, exactly. And I must say that our constitutional court and generally our courts in South Africa have been phenomenal at pointing out from a rationale of media freedom. It's all about the rights of the public to know. Essentially, the media are there as the eyes and the ears of the public. They are there to be the watchdogs on our democracy, to be the fourth estate, and to ensure that they hold power to account, whether it's private power or whether it's public power. And our jurisprudence has been, in many ways, precedent-setting on the issue of the right to know, access to information, open justice, and significant developments, for instance, in our defamation law. So, what the protection we give to our journalists and to the media affects every one of us. It allows us to be full participants in our democracy if we ensure that we jealously guard the rights to freedom of expression and the media.
Well, I'm glad you bring up South Africa because former President Jacob Zuma was talking about bias this week at the Zondo Commission, saying that's why he supported ANN7, for instance. Based on your work in this country, how often are journalists at fault, and how often is it just easy to say, because I don't agree with what the journalist says, therefore they're biased? I mean, you've had first-hand, you've been close at the coalface of a lot of those cases.
Well, I have, Francis, and of course the other side of the coin is, of course, media responsibility. So while we recognize, as we must, the importance of media freedom, journalists and the media need to ensure that they have public trust and credibility because they strive for the truth. That must be their first prize, and they must act reasonably in the way they gather the news and in the way they report the news in a fair way. So that's the other side of the coin. And it seems to me that no project that is there to protect media freedom will be complete without considering the other side of the coin, namely that the media must ensure that in exercising their responsibilities and in exercising their rights, they have due regard to the rights of others, so that they ensure that the media freedom that we all strive for and that this panel is set up to protect and to enhance is exercised in a manner that is responsible. It's a responsible exercise of power that is, of course, something that must be achieved.
Yeah, and maybe it's worth mentioning there that the Zondo Commission has released a statement saying that some journalists are incorrectly saying that Jacob Zuma's legal team must be given questions as part of a deal, that's not true. So journalists do get it wrong. You're talking about responsibility. But now, just make this practical for us, Dario. How can the law be used on a global basis to advance media freedom? What exactly will your work entail on the panel?
Well, just to give one example, Francis, we will be looking at laws around the world that are used to punish journalists, such as criminal defamation, insult laws, and laws that are designed to guard against false news, but that are often used to target journalists. And part of our brief will be to examine what those laws look like, how they are used against journalists in a way that's an abuse of power, of government power. And then we'll be recommending how those laws should be reformed and changed, or if necessary, eradicated, so that best practice would be that you can't have laws unless certain minimum standards are complied with. So that's one important part of the panel's work. And the other part of the panel's work is to look at the issue of safety of journalists, journalists who are abducted, and look at very practical ways of how the law can assist. One example is transparency in relation to trials of journalists. And around the world, we know that when journalists are detained and when they're imprisoned, sometimes there's a veil of secrecy in certain countries that exists so that one can't even find out whether the journalists are safe or not. That's one of the concerns that the panel has, and it's one of the issues that we will be debating and deliberating on, and hopefully coming up with very practical ways of trying to assist and trying to ensure that there is accountability, so that essentially there are disincentives to abusing journalists and punishing them really simply for doing their jobs.
All right, thank you for your time this evening. Congratulations being appointed to that panel fighting for the rights of journalists, and as all, Wentzel partner and media law expert Dario Milo. All right.